All right, I'm hoping that should hopefully have fixed it. I'm just going to see if that is the case. I think it may have been a VPN issue that was chugging some stuff on my end. We're going to test that out though. See here if it's still giving me an encoding lag once I've got my camera back up and running. If it's not, happy days. If it is, maybe these glasses were too powerful for me to realize. At the moment, no, this looks pretty sick. So it was probably a VPN issue that was causing some problems, probably with things trying to go to one spot to another, and another follow even before we're starting. Thanks, RZDU. I'm taking a guess on how that's pronounced. If it's not right, let me know. Okay, I'm going to assume that's still working and hit the record button. If it is, we're going to start slightly back from the start to explain it all again. If it does break everything, I'll stop recording and we'll just go through it and we'll figure it out. Close enough, I'll take it. All right, recording again. We're still fine here. We're starting to lose some frames. Nope, we're losing too many frames. We are not recording. We are pulling it straight from Twitch. Woo! Okay, cool. Let's just kick it off then. All of this gets to be filtered in and we'll work our way around it. All right. So let's get started. Again, this is where, and I think you can see my mouse on screen. Perhaps. There we go. This is where we want to end up getting you to. Glare. Ozzy I can do. Easy. Who am I? Well, if you're watching the stream, you probably know of Wesk. And I'm a person who's in Wesk's Discord. My name is Jericho. GD, if I'm streaming. Let's start with a little bit of my history. I'm a relatively new player. I only started playing properly in 5.4. Deep lore historians will know that I technically started in, I think, around 5.1. And then didn't actually unlock a job stone and quit before I got any further than that because the game desperately needed to be cleaned up at that point. And it did. And I came back early 2021, I think it was, and started playing. When I started playing, I did not like healing. It was pretty gross. I also started raiding much later in 5.4, and then finished E12S and Uwu in 5.5. At that point, still didn't like healing much. It was a thing I did, but I wasn't really into it. Picked up Sage in 6.0 when Endwalker dropped, and hated healing slightly less. It took me a little bit. I figured out how Sage worked, and that helped me, I guess, reframe some of how I healed, which was quite good. And then in 6.1, when they fixed White Mage, I picked up that job and started playing that a bit more aggressively and got pretty good at healer, as you can see from some of my edited logs from some selected logs from the first tier. This time, I think I'm also orange this tier on my healer alt. But haven't really been... I'm still waiting to get BIS to worry about anything like that. This tier. Moving on, here are some people you might recognize me as if you've either seen me stream or played with me in game. We have Jericho Drucht, the original and the best Jericho. Unfortunately, they do fish, however, for better or for worse. We then have Wind Up Jericho, is my main healer ult at this point. Smaller, cuter, but cannot be trusted. Third, we have Intercardinals, my EU main, but they mostly tank, and probably smokes, because it's EU European. And Jericho Ericto, who's a new Materia main character, and potentially a future hero of the data center, since they'll need people who know how to play there, but hasn't figured out their glam or beaten Heavenswood yet. So they're still a little bit of a far distant character that we'll see. Moving on. Let's get into the actual meat and potatoes, or meat alternative for vegetarians. Why don't people like healing? And I think the first one we need to address is healer anxiety. It's a pretty common thing that people who want to get into healing probably don't get into it because, they're anxious about it. And the thing is, if you make a mistake when you're healing, you'll probably cause some wipes. Tank dies, all of a sudden you're running around trying to raise the rest of the party, trying to keep everyone alive while the tank's rezzing, and it's not a great time. You feel pretty bad about it. And yes, thank you. This is, in case you're not aware, Prezi. Prezi is what I'm using for this presentation. Online, free, very convenient. Um, but I do want to, run a bit of an experiment in terms of how people feel anxiety and what you potentially, or like the reaction we've got. So again, what we've discussed is the part of the reason people don't like playing healer is because they're anxious about making mistakes. So I want you to think back to a dungeon you would have run where you saw the healer really mess up. Like, I mean really badly. Like, we're talking wipes here. We're talking couldn't keep the tank alive, probably spamming Q1 or something like that. Just, not doing really great. And then I want you to think about who that healer was. I want you to like tell me their name. Because the thing about it is that you probably don't actually remember the people who mess up. And if we were to really go through and think about the tank, think about the people who are dying, or the people we probably do pay more attention to when we're complaining, it's like, oh, this is the DPS who's just like doing single target rotations. And they're like pretty much the least important person to be worried about is the other DPS. It's not like, well, I mean, to be fair, is it actually though? Like, because we still need to kill things quickly. And if we don't take people out before we, if we take too long to kill enemies, we're going to just like mess stuff up. So like the thing that people are really worried about with playing a healer is that they're going to be judged, or people are going to be like critical of how they're playing. You can probably already demonstrate to yourself that that's not how you, as an average Final Fantasy player, or potentially World First Racer, I know some people in this chat, probably actually perceive people. And if you are perceiving problems, it's not going to be about the healer most of the time. Now, let's run this experiment a bit further. So we've talked about, we were thinking back to those people where it's like, oh, this person's playing poorly. This person is really struggling to damage, to heal, and they're not keeping everyone alive. And I want you to think back and how what you did in that situation was you went into chat immediately and were like, wow, can you believe this terrible healer is in our party? I can't believe they don't know how to heal. What are you doing? You shouldn't even be playing this game. Can you get out of here? Seriously, why even bother? Just quit. Like, you're such a loser. And then I want you to remember the next part where none of that actually happened. And probably what did happen was when they wiped, they said, oh, I'm sorry. And you're like, no worries, we'll try it again. And you just did the pull, or maybe just no one said anything, and it was fine. And so, like, it's really odd that people, I think, in the same way that people maybe tend to assume the worst will happen to them a lot more often than it actually does, despite the fact that they themselves, and I kind of hope anyone who is watching this is this way, are way more willing to help and just totally accept when people make some mistakes and get through it. So, like, a lot of this anxiety that we worry about, if we sort of stop back and actually are sort of aware of how we ourselves play, it's really just not a thing that is present in the game. Like, I know the whole great community, by the way, meme, that definitely does exist. And it's not to say that people aren't going to exist in the game who are going to be shitty. That's just kind of a fact too. But there's enough experience from it that if you're worried about it, that a lot of the time people aren't actually going to make a big deal out of it. So, and while it's not something that you can, like, again, anxiety is a general thing that you have to overcome and work on, isn't going to be something that you can just completely eliminate and just say, oh, I'm just not going to feel anxious tomorrow or today when I do it. What you can do is you can find the things, and like as part of this, we can try and improve how you're playing and get a bit of a better concept around, what you do and how you play, to actually limit the risk to go from, well, what if they find out that I don't know how to heal and I'm basically just sneaking through this like by the skin of my teeth and like anything could go wrong at any second, And you just need to sort of shift that narrative to, I might make a mistake, and I hope no one notices that I didn't use presence of mind on cooldown, and I drifted that by 2 GCDs. And you just need to make the problems that you face just littler problems, and just focus on the little ones. And once you work on the fundamentals and bring that up, then all of a sudden you won't have those issues, or you'll be sort of less worried about it. So start worrying about the things that, could go wrong, that you aren't trying to fix. And we try and fix those things you can fix, so then you worry about the pointless things like perfect DPS. And this is a pretty big one as well. If you're still, after all this, anxious about healing, it's because you're forgetting about basically the strongest mitigation tool in the game. Because a lot of people, you want to make sure you're using the full toolkit. There's a lot of heals available. And again, things with the tanking stuff, like tank LBs, healer LBs, swift cast rays, benediction, all these tools, right? That are really useful. Let me show you the strongest piece of mitigation in the game, by far, bar none. Quite literally. This is what it is, okay? Literally just saying to people, hey, I'm practicing. If I make a mistake, that's okay. Just expect it. And then you don't have the tank going in there expecting to do these god pulls because they're going to be able to drop down to 46 health and know that you were just going to bam, benediction, on instinct, because that's who you are. You just tell people, hey, I'm working on it. If you have feedback, let me know. Now, importantly, some people might give bad feedback. And that's sometimes a case of figuring out how, what advice is good and what advice isn't. All this advice, great advice. Don't you worry about it. But being open and talking to people doesn't just have to be a, wave in chat when you start. If you're not sure, just tell people. And they'll probably be okay. Because at the worst, it's all right, I'll slow down a little bit. I'll use my mitigation a bit more, conservatively. Or a bit more, if I need to. And hey, guess what? If a paladin needs to use a clemency here or there just because you are struggling, it's better that they do that because you're now aware of it. Okay, I need more healing here. And you can carry on. It's not all of a sudden a slight of, wow, this healer has no idea what they're doing. I better heal for them. It's open dialogue. Don't just make it something you carry on your own. Work with the people you're playing with to actually overcome that. So that's part of the anxiety thing. Now, difficulty. Difficulty is another thing. Because people tend to view healer as a pretty difficult role to play. And it's mainly because a lot of the toolkit is situational. So to a degree, right, do I want to use this now? Do I want to use it later? Is it a 2-minute? Should I use my Lily Bells now, or should I save them until later? Again, all the fairy heals. Well, if I use dissipation, I get more healing stacks that I can use in stronger healing magic, but then I don't have the fairy and I lose access to the fairy skills. Is that the right thing to do? And to a degree, right, that is different from a lot of the ways that most of the DPS and a lot of the DPS roles in particular are built. In that is basically, if you have a thing on cooldown, you don't you want to hit that button as soon as it's not on cooldown. Whereas that's not quite the case with healing. But there is a really simple solution to learning how to deal with this. And it's, I think, a mistake that a lot of players also make when they're trying to figure out how to play healer, or especially coming to it now, it's endgame, maybe I want to pick up healer, don't know, what do I want to do? And the secret to playing healer well, just play healer. Just play it. Just do it. The reason I'm going to be very actually pointed about this is that people get worried about playing healer. But the thing they're more worried about is making sure that they've gotten every job to 90. And they're going to do that through things like the tribe quests, things like the roulettes, particularly MSQ roulette. And so all of a sudden, you've leveled a job to 90, mainly by playing it on 2 dungeons that are kind of irrelevant, Oh, and one trial at level 50 for a couple of months. And then it's all of a sudden it's just like, why can't I play this job at 90 that I've only played at 50 for like one pointless fight a day? And it's basically the whole thing, right? And why I very strongly, for anyone who's leveling stuff in general, make use of those roulettes because they are good experience. That makes sense. But do that in concert with actually playing the job. Leveling it through regular roulette, or the regular dungeons. Try and play it through. Understand what those skills are for. And this works for DPS and tank and healer. Because, yeah, all of a sudden, if you don't understand how things fit together, then you're going to struggle. And in healer in particular, people get worried about it because we mentioned before, healer anxiety or tank anxiety, they just write it through the easy content that gives them a lot of experience relative to time, and then all of a sudden turn up with a job that now they have a new anxiety around because they've leveled up all this stuff without taking the time to learn how those work or go through the natural learning curve. And have just kind of dumped themselves at level 90. They've bought a boost, right? They bought a boost with time instead of with money. And that's kind of, hey, guess what? If you have a character you've played that way, you've boosted it. Now you have to make up for that with practice and experience. So, in simple words, to learn to play a healer, just do what you've been putting off for a while, right? That's as simple as it gets. Just bite the bullet, go and queue into some dungeons for a bit. Now, not yet. We've got a bit more of a guide to get through before we get to that point. But pretty simply, you can't just you can't learn to play heal, you need the experience to learn to play. Now, what does a good healer need? This is a good thing, right? I feel like in the same way we've discussed with anxious or being anxious about healing or tanking. Again, a lot of this stuff can apply to tanking as well as healing. But what a good healer needs, people are like, what does this person have that makes them a good healer? And I think there are really 3 things that makes a person really well equipped to play a healer. And if you don't have these things, maybe playing a healer isn't for you. So the 3 things that I think every good healer should have is a visible party list, a functioning controller or keyboard and mouse, depending on your preference, and a job stone, unless you're a conjurer under level 30. If you have those 3 things, you have the potential to be an excellent healer. No questions, no doubt. Those are the 3 things that every great healer probably needs, unless they are a Hawk Manor ace conjurer, which is probably the one exception to this rule. Which, okay, let's be real. That's a little bit of a joke there, but it is still probably reflective of what I think. And we've already sort of covered this already, but some of the things that people do need, and people tend to overestimate a lot of what you actually need to be a good healer. And it's just things that are relative to being generally a good player and someone who wants to improve overall. One is understanding of your toolkit. And that's something I really hope to help people with today, is learning how to frame the skills they've got in their toolkit as a healer in order to understand how and when to use them, and how to think about them. Because people don't necessarily know how to think about a lot of healing kits, aside from, again, it does healing potency, which a lot of the time is kind of all you need to know. In the same way a DPS skill does damage, healing does healing. Simple as that. The second, and this is a big one, it is a honest approach to responsibility about your play. What I mean by an honest approach to responsibility is that you should be really focused on understanding where you mess up and where other people mess up, and where you aren't messing up and where they're not messing up. So what that means is when the tank dies in a dungeon, you have to be able to understand and figure out, was there something I did there that was wrong? was there something there that I could have done differently? Not just say, oh, I'm a terrible healer. I guess I fucked up and I'm just bad at this. Like, if you're doing that, you're kind of not going to be able to improve regardless. And this applies a lot to probably improving in any content, is taking that responsibility. And hey, look, this is exactly what I'm saying. Is if you always assume you've messed up, you'll never be able to improve. Because when you're assuming you've messed up, like, here's the secret thing, right? The best way to improve is to find out exactly what things you're terrible at. Because as soon as you know what you're bad at, you can start changing those things. You can say, okay, well, I tend to panic. So what I probably need to do is take better control of the heals that I've got. I need to, like, plan them out a little bit more. I'm going to hit this, and then I'm going to hit this, and then I'm going to hit this. That should work. And if it doesn't, then we'll go back and figure out, okay, well, did I do too much there and didn't leave enough for later? Did I do the right thing, but the DPS was doing so little damage that, like, by the time I used up all the heals that I planned to use, the tank, like, me and the tank have both used everything, and just everything's not dead. So, like, all of a sudden we're dying there. Or conversely, is it, oh, actually, I used my skills in the wrong order, or, like, use things too early or off on the wrong target, and I need to be better at targeting skills, or planning where we're going to use them, in order to, like, make good use of them, right? Like, while it's a fun gag to say, hey, I'm terrible at the game and I'm just kind of, like, making mistakes and that's who I am, if you want to improve, you really just need to, like, focus in on what you are doing well, what you're doing not well. Take pride in the fact that, hey, you know what? Like, I am struggling in some of these bigger wall-to-wall pulls, but, like, in any boss fight, I'm keeping full uptime and doing everything on OGCDs. And that's a really strong start. If you can do that part at the start, right? Then you go back and you look at it's like, well, how well was the tank using their cooldowns? Were they doing good damage while we were doing this? Or were they kind of just jamming stuff through? And it's not great. You know, like, and this is the thing, right? Is taking that responsibility, especially once you get into a raid situation where the damage is a lot more controlled. It's a lot larger, but it's very controlled. Understanding, and this is something we'll touch on, did people get healed well? It's not a case of did you heal well or not. It's a case of, you know, you could be the best healer around, but if you're not actually being supported by people who are getting healed, then you've got a real problem. So take that responsibility on, like, and take it on honestly, so that you're not trying to just blame yourself for things that you aren't bad at. And then all of a sudden, like, hey, cool, you start eliminating things that are causing you problems, and focus on the things that, you know, you eliminate things you think are causing you problems but aren't, and focus on the things that you are doing well, and, you know, accentuate that. And you can just improve in leaps and bounds. Because I don't think you're a trash player. Like, plain and simple. A lot of the time, if you can see what you're doing wrong, that's the first step. Then what you need to do is just make sure you see what's going wrong, and start improving on that and start working your way through it. Also, thank you for the follow, Prince. And Sereth, you're doing perfectly fine. But next up, whoop, we go over there for some reason. The last is, and we've already sort of touched on this already with the difficulty part, but getting good experience. So when that comes to leveling stuff up, it's a case of not just filling an XP bar, it's filling your own XP bar in that job. It's not a case of saying, well, I'm struggling with Astrologian, the cards are kind of hard to manage. It's a case of saying, you know, like, well, what part of it is hard? What do I need to work on with it? How can I improve that? Next time I'm going to run a dungeon, and I'm going to make sure that I'm playing all my cards on cooldown. Even though, like, technically speaking, that's not necessarily how you would always want to play them, especially if you're getting into really optimized Astrologian play. But at a start, say, okay, I'm going to play this on cooldown, so I get a feel for when these cards are coming out. Or, like, learning those tricks. Like, for example, the cards come out every 30 seconds. Your dot refreshes every 30 seconds. So you make a rule and say, okay, whenever I reset my dot, I'm going to play a card. reset dot, play a card. And then all of a sudden you're now working on keeping your dot uptime high, as well as keeping your cards played high. And you start focusing on that. When you get those under control, then you look for other things. Do I need to snap heal in certain areas? Am I wasting heals in other parts? Start working your way through there. And it's sort of just that steps along the way that you can find to improve. Getting that experience and intentionally trying to play better is going to make a huge amount of difference. So, again, all the things you really need to play are those first three things. The things that are going to come afterwards that are actually going to make you a great healer, and this is, again, a great DPS or a great tank, is understanding what you've got, taking proper, honest responsibility, and then getting experience that helps you improve. And those are the three things that are going to move you from good to great. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then let's get into some core healing concepts. Oh, man, you're all so generous. Thank you, Casual, for the gift to Sean. I do like that so far. This is now, I think, maybe the third person I think who I've seen has gotten a gift, and the first person who has gotten a gift who actually plays Final Fantasy, which is very exciting. It's very nice for the people who actually probably would most enjoy the content to actually have got the the subs. All right, so let's get into it. This is a big call, I think, the biggest lie in healing, but it's probably something that you've definitely heard of before. And let's get into it. So limbo is a no-go. Let's dispel this myth. What we're talking about is limbo healing. This is probably one of the first pieces of advice you hear when it comes to healing, which is this idea that what you want to do to heal is to pick a level, a health level for the tank or just your general party health, and heal them when they get to that point. So you say, okay, I'm going to say at 50% is the point where I can comfortably heal them. So I'll just focus on DPS now, and then, they've got down to half. I'll start healing them back up. It does seem good in practice, especially when you're starting out, because it does focus on DPS. And in case it hasn't been clear, and for people who are less familiar with how Final Fantasy works and sort of the responsibilities, healers are DPS too. They just do healing on the side. So having this focus where we focus on doing DPS, only heal a little bit when you need to, instead of just like sitting there spamming heals until everyone else deals with the enemy problem. That's good in theory, right? So that's like a good starting point for understanding how healing works. The problem with it is that it mostly applies to early level Conjurer white mages, Conjurers/white mages, I should say, because of how their toolkit focuses on straight healing, that is to say, restores 400 potency of healing, or to the target. And again, that's the job that most people will start healing with is white mage, because it's the only job you can start at level 1 as a healer. The others you obviously have to unlock later on. So it's true for about up until you get white mage, I'd say, because honestly, you don't even get regen, which is a different type of heal, until you get to level 35, I think. So quite literally, you've gotten it through like 2/3 of the dungeons I think you would play in A Realm Reborn, in like the base A Realm Reborn, before you even kind of get the concept of different types of healing. And that's where limbo comes from, right? Which, yeah, we've covered. But the problem is that after this point, all of a sudden bosses, and if you can start doing the bigger pulls in some of those dungeons, they'll do more damage, and they'll do more varied amounts of damage. So it's not just a case that they'll do 15% of the tank's health in a hit, and you top them back up. Or even like with some of the earlier dungeons as well. So like Totorak now is a good example of this, where enemies will deal damage to you, but it's not very much damage. And you can just kill them before you even need to worry about healing. So you just burn them down, and you don't have to worry about that. So the problem with how limbo healing works is that it's teaching you something that's useful at first, but then isn't a long-term useful skill. So let's take a bigger look. And this is about healing tempo. So pacing out the heals. To try and basically address this a little bit more directly. So the big problem with limbo healing is that it assumes that you have two modes. Basically, that you are a healer and you are a DPS. And that's not really true. The problem, and probably the better way to think about it, is that healers have a flow or a general sort of, I call it a tempo or cadence. There's a few different terms I'll throw around for it, but I think a flow is also a good idea if you prefer that, where healers will want to heal in specific ways, which isn't going to be really terribly conducive with this limbo idea. And so what you want to think about it is how you can heal effectively, especially healing more to the party, by acknowledging and working with the flow of that heal. So we can compare two early White Mage spells. So this is regen, you get at 35, and then Cure 2 as an example. These are using the eventually upgraded values, but the actual theory works the same. So Cure 2 is a 800 potency heal, is active straight away, and takes 2 seconds to cast. Cool. So 2.5, again, same 2.5 second recast. Need to stand still for 2 seconds to cast it, and you'll heal 800 potency to the target when you heal them. Regen is a 250 potency heal over 18 seconds. So Final Fantasy, all the ticks happen every 3 seconds. So that means it'll heal 6 times over that 18 seconds. 250 potency per tick of that heal. It is importantly an instant cast, though again, still on that 2.5 second recast, so on the same global cooldown, giving us a total of 1500 potency over the 18 seconds. So if we just look at those raw numbers, right, Cure 2 is nearly like half the strength of a regen. So regen deals significantly more. You can use it while moving, heals significantly more, and you can use it while moving. So like, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to use that, right? But regen, because of the ticks taking time to actually be active, takes 12 seconds of active healing to be useful. So if you need to heal the tank up now, and they need 800 potency of healing, or if they need 1500 healing potency right now, that's not going to be very useful to hit regen. But understanding that in a dungeon situation where the tank is being attacked by enemies constantly, say for around 18 seconds or so, having that regen up and active is going to give them a lot of healing over that time, and it will be more effective to use than Cure 2. But at the same time, you'll still want to use Cure 2 to supplement that if the amount of damage that's coming in is more than what the regen effect is offsetting. And so basically understanding how these skills work and the sort of timing and that, again, that tempo of when you want to play these relative to when damage is happening is how you're going to be able to really move from a basic healer who hits that button that makes the health done go up to a healer who can sort of manipulate and control the flow of that. And importantly, and this is why it's I really focus on the issue with limbo healing, is that every healer has a different tempo that they play at. So again, a white mage tends to be a very aggressively, they want to heal lost damage. Something like, and this is actually why I kind of lean away from the barrier healer nomenclature, because yes, Sage and Scholar do have barrier tools that the others maybe not so much. But I like to think of them more as a passive healer, where both Sage and Scholar have really strong regenerative healing tools that are great at keeping someone topped up versus just healing someone who is hurt. And like as a general rule, for example, with Sage, the goal for playing a Sage is less about stopping someone from dying, but never letting them get so low that you're worried about them running out of health. So let's break this down a little bit further. And I think when I was thinking this through and trying to find the best way to explain this to people, the way I've come to sort of break it down, I'd say, is there are 3 general types of healing skills. This applies to both skills that directly heal or skills that buff other heals or mitigation, anything like that as well. 2 of them are probably going to be pretty straightforward, and the third one may be a little bit less intuitive, although perhaps pretty obvious in terms of naming. So there is proactive healing. That probably does what it sounds like. And there is reactive healing. So to expand on this a little bit, proactive healing are skills that you use before damage happens. So it's generally either skills that provide shields or mitigation to the target, or have a long active time that you can sort of apply well in advance. So skills like Adloquium or Heimer in the shield variants, or Temperance from White Mage that sort of is going to be a strong mitigation tool. Or even things like XCOG as well for Scholar as something you do ahead of time so that you can heal when the damage does happen. On the reactive healing front, these are skills used after damage occurs. So again, skills that are used to heal more aggressively when the party needs faster healing than the other 2 types allow. Yes, I've specified the other 2 types, even though we've only seen one already. We'll get to that. And so some good examples of this are Indomitability, Pneuma, and Benediction. So these are the sort of skills that say, your health is low, I would like your health higher now. I'm going to use them. So these are probably what people would think of in terms of healing tools. And so, for example, like I mentioned before with the sort of passive barrier healers, where White Mage is much more of a reactive healer, where a lot of their tools do want to heal someone back up, rather than being something you can use proactively. You do have something like Temperance and Divine Benison as well as a sort of a shield you can use early. But a lot of the White Mage's toolkit is reactive. The third category of healing that fits right in the middle here is simply active healing. So these are skills that I would usually suggest or think about as skills you will use while damage is occurring. So they're skills that either fit in with your standard damage rotation that you just are happy to use regardless, or generally have a short cooldown that you can just use them without having to worry about them too much. What these skills are doing are basically offsetting incidental damage. Things like auto attacks from bosses or dungeon mobs that you're not actually trying to stop a tank buster or anything like that, but damage will be happening. And so what you're doing instead here is fitting in these healing tools that can help offset that damage. So when you suddenly need to heal or there's a big attack coming in, you're not short on healing because these active ones have been running while this has been going on. So some examples of this, Afflatus Rapture is a good example, since White Mage wants to use the lilies regardless to keep Misery up and running. So you can just be throwing these out where it makes sense to use them. Not necessarily even just as a reactive healing tool to say, you're hurt, I'm going to top you up, but I will just use an Afflatus Rapture, and if you get healed along the way, happy days. Earthly Star being used mainly for DPS, but having that baked in heal as well that can help mitigate the need to actually heal using other like more active means. And Caracol, which is a very strong heal when it gets the heal upgrade, as well as the damage mitigation, and has a cooldown that is relatively short at 30 seconds. And with Adder's Goal generating every 20 seconds, you can basically, if you aren't needing other Adder's Goal heals, use Caracol on cooldown with practically no loss if you're not going to need it specifically for a mechanic. So these are the kinds of things we want to think about. Very importantly, skills can fit into multiple categories. A really good example of this is a skill like Recitation for Scholar and the ways that it works. Most people will think about Recitation as a proactive tool, mainly because you would use Recitation with Adloquium for a big shield, which you can then deploy, and all of a sudden you've got a really strong shield out for the party for a mitigation, or to mitigate a big raid wide, for example. But it's also really strong as a reactive healing tool if you use it with Indomitability. Especially if you're split up into, say, a light party scenario with the healers not together, and say the scholar is with their party and need to top them up after a raid wide hit. A recitation Indom could be, a lot of healing above what the shields that you get from a Loquium could be, or just, depending on the rest of the flow of the fight, is just something that shouldn't be overlooked as how you would use it. So understanding and sort of figuring out what tools there are and where you can use them, and sort of what places that make sense to use them, is a pretty good idea, generally speaking. Again, like at Flatters Rapture here, we've got the active healing, but he's also a very powerful reactive heal, alongside something like Plenary Indulgence to get the extra 200 cure potency per hit. That is a lot of healing you can just dump straight out to the party in the case of raid wides, or especially in some of the enraged situations where bosses will just start dumping massive raid wides at you one after the other. Being able to counter with your own big heals in response is a pretty powerful move. And now we're actually going to take a little bit of a detour here just to look at this in terms of tanking. Because I think 3 of the upgraded tanking skills are also a really good look at this in of how these healing type is expressed through other jobs that have access to these skills. So you can think about it not just in the sort of role like as a healer, but okay, do other jobs have these skills that can, we can make use of this with? So Heart of Corundum that Gunbreaker's got in this expansion is a proactive healing tool. Again, all of these that we're going to show have upfront mitigation, which is great because that's going to block damage. But, and especially if we think about this in a dungeon situation, this is going to mitigate some damage up front, but then it's also going to provide a heal eventually when the tank needs it, either after a certain amount of time or later on. So that can help you in a sort of proactive sense, because it is putting that heal out later on to help stop getting the tank too low. So if it is going to drop a bit, hey, we'll pop a little bit of extra healing on there on top of it. On the active front, we see Holy Sheltron. Holy Sheltron, on the other hand, is a regen effect. So again, mitigation up front, but then a steady cure potency over about 12 seconds, I do believe. And so that is another one where, for example, the tank would probably do well just taking a little bit of damage up front, so they're partially hurt, rather than just, again, I'm just going to emphasize, this is mostly in dungeon scenarios. Most of these skills you're going to want to use with, say, tank busters in general, but also actually with how strong these are and the healing effect they've got, using these relatively close to cooldown if you aren't going to need them otherwise, which is a tip we're going to cover off a little bit later on, is also very useful for tanks to keep them alive, especially with how this raid tier treats them. So this Holy Sheltron is an active healing ability because it gives you that regen effect that if you keep this rolling sort of as you're fighting, it'll help keep you topped up without needing to worry too much about dropping too low or going too high. On the reactive healing front is the big old broken boy himself, Bloodwetting, where to get the most value out of Bloodwetting, you would actually want to drop down to be quite a bit lower on health, because then you'll get quite a lot of healing out of it, and it means that you can save your mitigation tools, and the healer can save some of their healing tools as well, to let your health drop down before you then use the very strong healing to bring yourself back up. So if you're just using a Bloodwetting when you're at full health, yes, you're going to reduce some of the incoming damage, but you're not going to get any of the real healing benefit off of it, which is going to lose like half of the benefit of that skill, if not more. So remembering how those healing skills want to be used can make a really big difference in terms of how you actually get the benefit out of them. And again, not maximizing the benefit, but really just making use of it. So having looked at that, let's move on to our next section here, which is dungeon healing. And dungeons, or aka the secret DPS check. So let's take a dungeon and break it down a little bit. Because this is a thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that dungeons do have DPS checks. So obviously raids and the extreme trials and so forth, they've got DPS checks. And some dungeons will have DPS checks where you have to complete a mechanic or kill a boss before they do something that will just wipe the raid. But pretty much every dungeon in this game does have a DPS check. It's a DPS check against your tank. And so what we are needing to do is we're needing to beat the DPS check the dungeon is trying to meet against your tank. So, over the course of us doing the dungeon, we need to heal more than what the dungeon will throw against you. So, at low levels, and where we sort of, the limbo healing kind of starts out, the reason that's not too bad is because the healing that's coming in, the damage that's coming in is so low relative to the healing that's going out, you can literally just take seconds worth of damage and then just pop a heal, and that's covered the DPS check from the dungeon entirely. But as you start getting further on, especially probably, I think, when I was thinking this through, probably the first real healing / DPS check in the game is in, which dungeon was it? I think the 35th, level 35 dungeon, is probably the first real DPS check. If you take some of the early ones in, Sunken Temple of Khan, that does have some of the few enemies at the start, if you pull too many and don't know how to heal that or can't keep up with the DPS coming in, will kill you. And then, especially with that at the start, healers are kind of fairly limited at that point, where they don't have AoE skills. They do have a dot, but that's about it. So it can be a little bit spicy, and heck, even at that point, just pure healing can be the right move in terms of efficiency. But once the game sort of figures out what it wants to do, everything from level 51 onwards follows a pretty standard format. There'll be 2 sets of wall-to-wall pulls, each about a minute apart. So basically from pulling one set of enemies to killing them and then pulling the next set of enemies will be separated by about a minute. And then there'll be a mini boss, which is about 2-ish minutes long. And then that's done 3 times. You'll get, again, some dungeons where there is a single pull between bosses. Again, some good examples of this are Mount Gulg has it. The level 63 dungeon has a really big pull in the second section. And there are some others. So there are exceptions to these rules in the same way that some of the later dungeons, like the 83 dungeon, has the middle section will be sort of 3 smaller pulls or like a little gauntlet of enemies that pop up. But for the most part, wall-to-walls, 2 wall-to-walls, boss, 3 times. This is really consistent for us, though, and what makes it very easy for us to plan. And because we know that things are going to be separated by roughly a minute or 2 minutes, we can then work a heal plan to sort of not even have to think about what we're using when, because we know that we will have things off cooldown by the next time we actually have to hit something. Which, very importantly, is something that generally will make wall-to-wall pulls safer than single pulls in a lot of cases. That being that if you know that if you use your 1-minute skills in a dungeon and defeat the enemy, if you're doing the wall-to-wall where there is that minute gap between starting one pull and starting the next, that minute that you've taken to defeat the first set of enemies and move on to the second set will reset the cooldowns and basically let you go back in pretty much fresh into the second set. If you do 2 sets of pulls, you're probably taking less time overall, but not that much less. And so you end up probably going into the next pull with fewer cooldowns available. And all of a sudden, you're trying to fight some enemies, and if they do, a bit of an extra damage, you don't have some of the sort of active and proactive tools that you would have had otherwise to offset damage that's incoming and can, wipe the group. Whereas if you're sort of aggressive, things like tank mitigation and a lot of healing tools scale better with more enemies. Essentially, if a healer can dump a lot of heals and the tank can then absorb all that damage and it sort of offsets together, that means all the DPS you're throwing against multiple enemies is just free damage. And that's great. You save time. You level up faster. You learn to be a good healer. You do all those things that are great and make you good because you followed this instruction. So that's the plan, or the sort of structure. So let's have a look at what the actual plan turns into. And we'll put it all together. Now, important to note, especially when we are doing those wall-to-wall pulls, dungeon damage is the highest at the start of a pull. Bosses are nothing. They're pretty much nothing to worry about. But when you've got 8, 10, 12 enemies all attacking you all at once, that's going to be effectively a massive dot against your tank, and you have to heal enough and they have to mitigate enough to offset that. And that's the part where you need to be the most aware. And because of that, you also want to, in response, dump a lot of your healing at the start of the pull rather than necessarily trying to trickle it out the same way a tank wants to. So in the same way a tank would generally want to sort of space out their cooldowns over that time and generally lead with a stronger cooldown so it offsets a lot of the bigger damage coming in first, and then using the other cooldowns to, manage the way through the weaker groups of enemies that are left over, which tend to still do a bit of damage because the stronger enemies will have more health and you're so more dealing with the little trash mobs in there. But you do want to front load a lot of your healing just to offset it. So as we mentioned, because the dungeons are generally 2 wall-to-wall pulls, a minute apart between the bosses, we can set up the following heal plan that'll work basically in 99% of the time, or 99% of cases, with the exception of some of those other dungeons that have weirder mob setups. So every wall-to-wall pull, we'll want to alternate our 2-minute abilities, or 2-minute or longer abilities. So we'll use 1 on each wall-to-wall pull. Every wall-to-wall pull will use any of our 60-second abilities. So we can basically dump them all. And again, if we've killed enemies at a decent pace, which if we kill them slower, heck, that's even better for us technically, to a degree, as long as we don't die. They'll be back up off cooldown for the next pool of enemies. No worries about that. And then we use our 30-second skills, or just generally the lower cooldown skills, pretty much on cooldown or as it makes sense to use them, as we can, effectively make use of them. And this basically means we can dump a lot of healing, especially when you get into high-end content. So we're going to look here at a level 90 example for Astrologian. So this is what we could do for Astrologian in Expert or level 90 roulettes. Every other pull, we can use either Macrocosmos or Neutral Sect going into the pull to preload some shields, or in the case of Macrocosmos, smack all the enemies for a big hit of damage and then stock up that healing to pop out later. Every single pull in level 90, Astrologian has access to Exaltation, Horoscope, Minor Arcana, Earthly Star, Celestial Opposition, and Collective Unconscious. Every single pull, as well as every boss twice, healers can use that many skills, or an Astrologian could use that many skills and not run out of, not be short the next time they fight enemies. So, if you just think about, roughly speaking, what's a good example? Like Al-Shadol's Legacy, that's a slightly faster one, but you could be using all of those skills plus one of each of the first 2 on both of those first 2 mobs of enemies. And again, not be short on abilities. And then as needed, we've also got Celestial Intersection and Essential Dignity on top of that. Again, 2 quite powerful healing tools that we can weave in. Celestial Intersection every 30 seconds and Essential Dignity every 45 with the charge setup. So you've got a lot of heals available to you. And because what we're thinking about is doing this and proactively using these skills, we're able to really plan out and sort of stop a lot of the damage that would be the scariest, which is, oh no, the tank's getting low. We can deal with that because, let's have a look here, right? Macrocosmos is a big hit against a bunch of enemies, which is always nice. We love damage. Plus a 200 potency heal along with half of the damage the tank takes in the time between the skill starting and finishing. Neutral Sect is a 20% magic boost as well as a pretty hefty shield if you throw out the Expected Benefic while you're running, again, because it's an instant cast, or Expected Helios as well if you really want to double down on it, to give the tank both a regen effect while you're pulling enemies as well as a shield on top of it. that is buffed by the 20% buff. And then every pull here, we've got, I believe, a 500 potency shield plus 10% mitigation, a either 250 AoE attack against enemies or a 400 potency cure, 700 total potency AoE heal, a 500 potency AoE. This is a 700 potency regen. Total potency regen, I should say. This is a 500 potency total regen plus the mitigation. This is like a 540 potency heal plus a 720 potency attack, and then a 400 potency heal if we squeezed in an expected Helios beforehand. Plus 3 to 900 potency heals in Essential Dignity, and 2 effective 600 potency heals with shields in this every 30 seconds. You've got enough tools to keep the tank. We didn't even talk about tank mitt, let alone troubadour. Guys, healers are strong at level 90, by the way. So, and again, right, we're talking about this as a dungeon approach. So when you're lower levels, you won't have access to all these skills or all these charges. So we will, like, the damage coming in will generally be lower. So you can still build up to it as you need. But and again, like, for example, that's at 86, that's at 70, that's 62. I think that's 50. No, that's 60 and that's 58. Like, so these skills aren't all available right away, but the same logic does apply, right? And where you don't have all of the extra abilities to make up for it, we still have the regular GCDs as needed, where, as mentioned, you can, as you're pulling, throw an expected benefic on the tank, and if needed, when you finish and pull all the enemies, throw a expected Helios to start as well, so you've got 2 regens running in tandem at the start, and then you can supplement them as needed afterwards if you need it. But assuming the tank's using their mitigation as well, which, again, they've got their own loop, they can use Reprisal every pull, they can swap between Rampart and their 2-minute mitigation there as well, they have Arm's Length on 2 minutes, all of these things on top of what you've got, they have a lot to support you as well. But what the real takeaway here for, in terms of playing a healer in dungeons, is be super aggressive with using those heals, so you don't get into a situation where you need to then try and save the pool. If you're playing aggressively enough as a healer, again, pretty much everything here is OGCD as well. So you can just be slamming gravity non-stop while throwing out all of these healing tools as well. So just, like, keep that in mind, because it's really just a overwhelming amount that you can do. And this is just one healer, who people would generally call kind of difficult. Oh, and of course, you've got the card stuff going in here as well. So you'll have both buffs to the rest of your team to make them deal more damage to kill enemies faster, and the potential to trigger Astrodyne as well, with Astrodyne giving you buffed attack and recast speeds, meaning you can heal faster if you need to, or just generally attack faster to deal more damage, and even buffing your own healing as well, and offsetting your mana cost. So it's very, 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 like, these things multiply very quickly. So if you are struggling to keep up in dungeons, probably the mistake you're making, if anything, is being too reactive. And sort of what we're taking here, right, is understanding a lot of these skills. So these two here would fall under the proactive heals. This is more of a sort of a reactive, but mostly an active heal you can throw out. It mitigates some damage, and then it heals. Horoscope is proactive. You throw it out before the pull, pop it when you need it. These are reactive. These two here can be quite active heals, where you're providing that regen over time, as well as mitigating damage. And Earthly Star, if you need to pop it as a reactive measure, you can do that, or just let it sort of sit there and eventually pop itself. And these two being fairly reactive, with Celestial being a bit more of a proactive move as well with the shield. So, yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Just make sure you understand that you've got batches of skills, mostly in 1 minute and 2 minutes, that this will apply to. And from there, just, like, understand, okay, we're going into a thing. And again, if you know anything about me, you'll know that I love hotbar setup. So a really good start for you is to probably group your 2-minute skills together, group your 60-second skills together, and group your the shorter than 60-second skills together, and just think about that. Okay, I'm going to a pool. Have I pressed a 2-minute button? Yes. Have I pressed all of my 60-second buttons? Yes. If not, can I, or is there a place for me to use it? Yes. Cool. Great. Again, and that's the same thing. If I have an active heal that I can throw out, do I just use that proactively? Absolutely. Proactively in the sense of use that rather than waiting, not actually use it before a pull. That's bad. Words are difficult. But with this in mind, this is probably if you take nothing away from healing or from this sort of discussion aside from this is the one slide that really focuses on and will change how you heal if you're not sort of aware of this or not sort of making use of this at the moment. All right, I'm going to take a brief moment to break and take a sip of water. I'm even actually just going to slam some ads in really quick because if anyone else wants to drop in, I don't want them to be slammed with an ad break. So just hang out for a minute. We'll be right back. If you've got a sub, hey, we'll just hang out and you can watch me drink a sip of water. And we'll pick up in just a moment. What up, subs, by the way? Let's hang out for 42 seconds. Secret zone. 42 seconds reminding me I still am not keeping up with my gather requests. But yet, here we are. Yeah, I'm going to quickly double check a few other things. Thank you for the kind words about the presentation. It is always nice. Secret subzone. Subzone, underwater, hydration. That's a reference that I definitely made on purpose. Anyway, that's what I didn't want anyone else who wasn't a sub to know about healing. Don't worry, you guys have got the good stuff now. Moving right along, we've only got a little bit left, actually, all things considered. I did really need that sip of water, though. Let's have a look at some raid healing. Raid healing is, raid healing, what to expect when you're expecting to get hit for a lot of damage. The raid damage profile. So raid damage looks a lot different to dungeon damage. As we mentioned before, everything in this game is a dot. You just don't realize it yet. And dungeon damage is a dot against the tank. As long as there's enemies hitting them, the tanks are being hit by a dot and need to be healed and maintained. That's why we've got those active heals involved. Raid damage is instead highly scripted and highly consistent, which means if you know there is an attack coming, it's always going to come. It's probably always going to do roughly the same amount of damage, assuming there's not some weird mechanics involved that we aren't aware of. And so we can plan around that. So generally, as a rule, healing in raids is actually easier than dungeon healing a lot of the time, because if it's consistent, in dungeons, all you do is you just throw stuff on the ground, and then eventually things get better. Like, you throw things out. Again, there are lines on the floor. You throw things out. Now there's there's an earthly star on the floor. It'll eventually pop, kill some stuff. Everyone will be healed. Instead, raid healing is just you make a plan, use certain skills at certain times, and every clear will be consistent. It won't be a case of, did we kill the first set of enemies fast enough that when we get to the second set of enemies, our cooldowns are back? No, because the boss doesn't care. They're just going to use the same mechanics at the same time, every time. Happy times. Now, that being said, the challenge of healing in raids that is sort of less apparent than in dungeon settings is that positioning comes into a lot more. Raid environments are a lot larger, which means people are spread out, and where you're just generally a pack of 4 people trundling through the dungeon together, and makes it very easy. If you throw an AoE heal out, everyone gets hit. Mechanics will generally move people around and make you have to think a bit more, not only about how much healing is needed, but also about making sure that you are giving everyone heals, and on the other side, also that DPS or tanks are receiving those heals, which can be a really big thing to notice, and a really good reason to play healer in general is when you play a healer and all of a sudden you're noticing the DPS that aren't getting healed, and you go from saying, I can't believe the healer didn't heal me, to why was that DPS over there not getting my heals? Some things will click into place and start making you think a little bit about this instead. Now, that being said, this sounds scary a little bit. It's not that scary, but it's just, can be concerning. It's like, oh, I thought I just could like do mechanics, and like, oh, before, if you're newer to raiding as well and just trying to get into that, you might think, oh, well, I don't want to have to think about healing everyone, and like, I'm trying to do damage as well, and trying to keep on top of this. This seems like a lot. Good news. Thankfully, there's a co-healer. You got a friend. There's 2 people involved. Or heck, if you're in an alliance raid, you've got a whole little polycule of healers together, looking after everyone, relatively speaking. So this question about, and we used this example before, even when we were talking about recitation in Dom, is that a lot of the time, some of these mechanics where you need to worry about healing, it's not something you're worried about on your own. We're going to talk about making a heal plan in a moment, which is something I think you can still do outside of optimized, like very optimized or very early prog sessions. Something you can do, like mostly on your own. Because healing is not actually that bad, because as we mentioned, damage is very structured, and the sort of panic of, oh, what if they get hit? What if something goes wrong? Like, yeah, you're going to have to deal with that. But, like, you're not doing it on your own, and there are 2 people responsible for it. And a lot of those individual challenges, which are hard, become much less of an issue when you're doing it with 2 people. So let's talk about just generally heal planning, because to be honest, a lot of what we've already covered about dungeon healing kind of applies here, right? Use your cooldowns sort of as you've got them, plan around it, but let's make the actual heal plan as well to expand on this a little bit. So when you're getting started and you're not sure what to do, right? This is a absolutely foolproof way to approach healing in a raid. So again, one of the things that's really fun about healing is, well, people will complain, right? Healing's really simple. You only have like 2 buttons to attack, so it's really boring. But the thing that's different about healing is a lot of the ways that damage can happen can vary from fight to fight. So then you get to sort of, every fight is a bit different to play on healer. So it's not just a case of you go in, you do your rotation and figure out what's stopping you from doing your rotation. It's about figuring out what's the plan for this fight, what skills are going to go well where. Again, as we're saying here, that sometimes when you're starting out, it's pretty tough to figure out what to put where. So here's my, again, first plan, starting point for figuring out how to heal. Steal from better healers. Shamelessly. Do have no shame. Watch VODs. Check their clear logs. If they're streaming, like go onto their streams and ask them, and just directly copy their answers. It's not going to be perfect, because again, you don't always know, like, okay, why are they using it here or why not? But if you just go into a log and say, okay, we've got, for example, let's have a look. And again, there'll be some vague spoilers here we're talking about with some of the current raids here. One of the harder mechanics this fight would probably be the like manifold flame section in P8S, where you've got to spread out for the party, and then 4 players will get hit, and then the 4 people who didn't get hit have to soak a hit, and then you've got to move in. Like, you've either got to move in or be out, and that can be a very difficult mechanic to heal. So all you need to do is just go and find someone who's already done it and see what they did. Look where they moved, look what skills they used, and copy it. And then from there, if you figure out, okay, well, actually, we're still having a problem with this, or I'm overusing it, that's probably something where either the co-healer's doing more for it, and you can plan around that, or maybe they're struggling for part of it, so you may need to bring more to it. But as a base level, use that plan and start figuring out what doesn't or does work for you from there, and start using that as your basis to actually heal the fight. A lot of the times it can just be as simple as, I'm going to throw down some mitigation because there's a raid wide at the start. I'm going to throw, things like Asylum, which will passively heal through this raid wide or whatnot. And you start doing that, and then what you're going to do is you're going to build out from that point. But at least seeing where they're using it and then figuring out what parts you're struggling with is going to be a much quicker point than fretting for an hour and a half, at least, per raid night, about if you've got the right skills in the right places. Now, once you've got a general idea, and then, ready to start actually otherwise building it, or like just planning things out a little bit further, the simplest thing to do is rely on a timeline, and basically just place things out and see what you've got left over. So I was sort of mentioning here, what you want to do is pick big mechanics that are going to need your biggest healing tools. So again, if we look at something like P8S, the current fights, there's a section where the boss will turn into a large beast form and do basically 4 major raid wides back to back, followed by 4 individual hits that have to be soaked by 2 party members at a time. So what we need to figure out there is to say, okay, this is probably the hardest hitting part of this mechanic, and I'm actually going to need, as White Mage, both Liturgy of the Bell, which is a 3-minute cooldown, and Temperance to be used, which is a 2-minute cooldown, in order to soak up and heal enough damage during that time, along with all of the other stuff the rest of the party is using. What I can then say is, okay, if those happen then, well, I can now use Liturgy of the Bell again in 3 minutes' time. So what is going to happen either 3 minutes before this or 3 minutes after it that I can then use Liturgy with? Or similarly for Temperance, okay, is anything happening, or does that mechanic happen, earlier than 2 minutes, after 2 minutes into the fight? If so, there's probably something at the start I can throw Temperance on and be happy with it. You could eventually get into sort of like more optimized stuff, especially if it's very early, where you may want to throw certain skills out before pulling. So, for example, in P8S P2 at the moment, I'd want to throw an Asylum out about 5 seconds before the fight starts to get that running. It soaks up a little bit of damage and puts us in a good point against the first raid wide, but then is back up for a later raid wide because of the exact timing on it. And that's sort of more of an higher level thing, but just as a general idea of saying, okay, because we know when the next one is or where I'd want to use it, how can I time the prior one or future one in order to get access to having that skill up at the right time? And just sort of work forward and backwards from there until you fill it out. And then you look at the extra skills or extra buttons you've got in between and start popping them in. Okay, I'll have, nothing I use Divine Benison on here or here. Like, for example, there's no tank busters where I'd want to put them on tanks. So I can, for this section, pretty freely put them on other players if I see they're taking a bit of extra damage than I need to. But I'll need to hold it for this. Or similarly for Asylum, if I see, for example, there's a section here where we don't need Asylum on anything particular, just look for the most damage or the point where people are most likely to be standing together in one spot for as much of 21 seconds as possible. Plop it down there. And again, because of the way healing works, especially if you're not doing, as mentioned, highly optimized runs or week 1, week 2 stuff, your gear is going to offset 99% of the fears you've got. Because people will be surviving more things, you'll be healing much more strong. Like, you'll heal for more, and people will have more health to both survive hits and to be healed through. So it becomes a lot easier to do in an optimized, a properly geared scenario. So I don't start with week 1 healing. That's a point we'll come to in a second. But there's definitely, there's steps you can take. And generally, where we come back to and where we land with this is wanting to use the major abilities about as much as the fight timeline allows without wasting them. So, in that same idea, if we have something like Lilybell or Liturgy of the Bell, whichever name you want to use, Lilybell sounds cuter, so I'm going to call it that. If you have Lilybell, that has a 3-minute cooldown. So if a fight is 9 minutes or longer, you can afford to use Lilybell 3 times in that fight. That's the most you'll get out of it. That's a lot of healing. But if there's no good use at that 6-minute mark, well, actually, sorry, if it's 9 minutes, you get 4 uses out of it because of 0369. If there's nothing good at 6 minutes, but there's something great at 8 minutes, you probably shouldn't use it at 6 minutes just to have it available at 9 minutes. So that's kind of the idea, right? Is you do want to find some specific things. P4S was a really good example of this, where there was a great time to use it at 2 minutes, a great time to use it at about 7 minutes, and there would have been a really nice moment to use about 4.5 minutes. But having to, putting it there would sacrifice either one of those two better options where you do want to use it. So what you can do is you can just throw it out earlier at around that 1 minute mark where there's some other damage going out, because that, makes sense to do it, or in this case, not so much. But if you wanted to use the 4-minute one instead, you could find something around that first minute to use it until it's back on cooldown. But, at a certain point, that's what you're aiming towards. If you're just starting out in raids, you don't have to think about it anywhere near this much. Just literally say, there is a big hit, I am going to use big hit. And think about it as well, because something I don't mention here directly is some of those skills and the way we want to use it changes in context of the fight. Actually, we might even move into the last sort of general advice section that probably fits in here a little bit better. So we'll come back to that, put a pin in it, and we'll come back here. If you've got any questions you wanted to ask, get ready to fire those off in chat, all of you, because I know you've been sitting here burning away on them. And I'm actually going to now answer what I think I can pretty confidently say is probably the biggest question that anyone is going to ask. Deciding which healer to play first, right? Especially now, if you've heard me talk for an hour and 17 minutes or so and have said to themselves, you know what, I think I found what Jericho said to be pretty compelling. What healer do I play? There are two answers to this question. The first answer to this question, play a DPS. Learn how to play the game on a, I don't want to say no pressure role, but understand the fundamentals that this is a game about doing damage first, and not just about sitting around healing. Keeping uptime, always being casting, as an example, and then working your way back from there. Now, assuming you've played as DPS and you've got a bit more familiarity, again, I will make some concessions so you can play healer earlier on as long as we do some coaching, that's fine. But as a general rule, let's take a few things we can think about, right? Are there specific healers that, for example, you like for non-gameplay reasons that will help you play or help you stick it out and stay with it? So people obviously like Astrologian because they have a great aesthetic. People might like Scholar because it has probably one of the best job quests series in the game. So that sort of narrative that's driving you along playing could be a part of it. Or even something like I've mentioned White Mage and getting to see that the way the job changes over time. Or you like Sage because Sage has lasers and guns and shooty and it's the new shiny thing. So sort of unpacking some of those things can help you decide which one to play. The actual answer, though, is you just play Sage. There's no question. Sage is 100% the first healer if you're new to healing, but have gotten to level. If you've already beaten the game and now want to start healing, you start with Sage no matter question. No matter what, start with Sage. There's two big reasons for me recommending Sage for people who are already familiar with the game. First one, it emphasizes the most important thing about healing, which we've already mentioned, which is you are still a DPS who heals, not that you're a healer who can do DPS. Now, like, again, this is a very like cynical thing that people will throw out, kind of whatever. Also, do not judge me for Lala bias, and then also try and convince me White Mage has a better story quest than Scholar. I will fight you. Or Sage, or Astrologian for that matter. But Sage teaches you to heal. As an example, if you were to sit and spam the default heal spell on Sage, that is worse than being a cure spammer, because, in case you don't know, Sage is, for the potential WoW players out there, what some might call a discipline priest type role. Well, generally, it has a passive healing that triggers whenever you attack. So when you're attacking enemies, you are healing the tank. If you are casting a heal on the GCD, you are not healing with your passive heal, and therefore that healing is actually weaker because you're like, the assumed healing down here is not happening. So even though you're casting a heal, that heal is missing the default or some assumed heal underneath. The other thing that makes Sage a really useful healer to start out is basically what we've already discussed about the different skills you've got that fulfill different roles when you're trying to heal. Sage starts at level 70, so it has a lot of those skills already available to you. So you start with the ability to have those GCD heals that you can use when you're pulling and you're moving, the shields you can throw up, the dots, all of that stuff. And then you can throw out Physis 2, you can throw out Duracol, Toracol, all of that. Caracol, sort of, it's a little weird when it starts out, and so on. So you've got all that all ready to go. And Heimer, which is very powerful when it starts out. Instead of starting with, say, White Mage, where White Mage has attack, heal, attack, heal, attack, heal, attack, heal, eventually gets regen, which we sort of discussed before, gets stronger heals, and then eventually it gets things like Holy, which acts as a form of mitigation, and much, much later on, things like Asylum, which then sort of starts acting in that GCD space, or off GCD space, which, is also where we want to get with that comfort. So if you're already familiar with the game, Sage is 100% the healer you should start with. In the exception where you are starting out fresh, as long as you understand how you're meant to play healer, and we have that sort of, again, we can start working towards that, here's what you need to remember being a healer, then you have a bit more free roam. Although you still will have to wait until Heavensward to play the one with the fun dresses and the big hats. So that's that sort of question. Now, next is an inefficient heal is far better than no heal. Now, what this actually comes into is the idea of basically like DPS. If you've got a skill that you have on cooldown and you could use it and it does damage, you use it. You don't think about it. You just don't like sit and wait for an opportune time if it's not going to be used. You just throw it out and then wait till it comes back off cooldown again. If you don't have an intention for it to be used, you want to use it. So a really good example of this is Panheimer on Sage. So as we mentioned before, Sage starts off with this skill called Heimer. What that does is it applies a shield to a target, and when that shield breaks, it reapplies a shield. And it has basically 5 stacks. So basically you break through the shield. Whenever the shield breaks, it reapplies the shield, and mitigates quite a lot of damage. And anything that's left, if all the shields don't get broken, applies a heal at the end. Before, what we were talking about when we wanted to manage mitigation tools is balancing the 2-minute cooldowns from each dungeon pool, right? So group 1, you'd use 1 2-minute tool. Group 2, you'd use a second 2-minute tool. One of the 2-minute tools that Sage has access to is Panheimer, which is basically the same as Heimer, except it's applied to everyone, which, if you know Latin, probably makes sense. But it is slightly weaker. So it's the actual heal amounts are smaller, but it does hit everyone instead. Now, in dungeons, only the tank should be getting hit. But Panheimer is just sitting there not being used otherwise. So don't think to yourself, well, either I'm looking for the best opportunity to use Panheimer, so I better not use that until the party's taking damage. If only the tank's taking damage, that's a cooldown for the tank. Plain and simple. Another really good example of this in a very similar vein, actually, is Lilybell. So Lilybell is very similar. It basically places a totem function on the ground, this glowy bell. Whenever the white mage who places it gets hit, it releases a 400 potency heal, which is huge. It has 5 stacks, lasts for 20 seconds, and then similarly to Heimer, if the duration finishes, or the white mage chooses to finish it early, it'll then use any remaining stacks at half potency. Now, if you consider that thing at full potency is doing like 2,000 heal, like 2,000 potency to the entire party, that is a massive heal to everyone that it's going to throw out all at once, right? Now, that's really good. That's basically like a benediction, so like a full heal to the whole party. Now, what I want to throw out to you is this idea. If you throw out Lilybell, and the white mage doesn't get hit at all, or maybe he gets hit once, unfortunately, you only get a half benediction to the whole party. You only heal half their health, or something along those lines. That's a really good deal. That's so much healing every 3 minutes. Use that thing. So that same thing, right, is another mistake from what we already discussed is in the same way that people don't really respect the cooldowns, it's looking for the best time to use the heal. If the amount of time you have until the next heal comes up is greater than the cooldown, that is free healing. And that is a inefficient heal that's not going to do as much as it could in optimized scenarios, but those optimized scenarios don't exist in every single instance, so you use it as best as you can. So don't worry about that. Healing has AoE breakpoints. So here's a really important thing to learn if you're starting out in Final Fantasy, because as we mentioned, the single target meme DPS players, basically every job will have skills that are useful against groups of enemies and skills that are useful against single targets. And what you're normally going to look for is there'll be, based on the average damage you're doing, at a certain point, your AoE skills will do more damage than your single target skills will. Pretty easy. You get some complications with, well, this skill does damage over time, so if there are 3 enemies, you want to use that, but if there's 2 enemies, you just use a different skill, whichever one it might be. That applies to healing as well. So if we look at something like the Lily skills for White Mage, its single target Lily does 800 potency of cure. So basically the same as a cure 2 at the end game. So 800 potency of cure, of healing. The 2-hit or AoE heal does 400 potency of healing to anyone who gets hit. Now, if we do some very quick maths, 400 plus 400 equals 800, which is the amount of healing we just said a single target one does. So in the case we said before that the AoE, say for example a tank buster hits and it's a shared tank buster, so the 2 tanks have to get hit together, that AoE heal is equal to a healing one of them with the single target version. And if anyone else is hurt at that time, like it has some passive healing still going on, or that, hasn't fully healed, that is free healing. Unless there's some situation where one of the tanks then needs to be healed more than the other, and that's a pacing issue, and again, that's more advanced than where we're actually talking about today. But unless there is a specific reason to use a single target version, just throw out AoE. Like, AoE heals are often much, much better and much more efficient. Like, in the same way, so here, again, beginner concept. Early on as White Mage, you start off with the skill Cure 1. It does like 400 potency by default. A bit later on, you get Cure 2. Costs more to cast, but heals about 700. So nearly twice as much damage, but uses a lot more mana to actually cast it. But it's still only one cast. So it's significantly more efficient to use that. So part of this like early, the lesson you're learning is using Cure 1 is pretty bad because it's just, it's cheaper, but it doesn't heal as much, which means you then need to spend more heals using that, which we don't want. So instead we move up to the more efficient heal. We just Cure 2, we heal less, we damage more. Happy days. Enemies die. And so we basically just want to use that same logic of if there are heals that can apply even more healing. So again, a Flout of Solace would do 800, but if you can heal 5 people with a Rapture, that's 2,000 healing. Very efficient. And in the majority of situations in raids, there are probably 3 types of damage that occur. There's either tank-based damage, which is just generally, I guess, autos is probably the main version of this. There will be targeted damage, which will usually fall into specific roles, which can, like, I'm going to call things like tank busters as role damage, even though it's heavier damage. It is still targets these specific players, or things like tanks and healers get hit, and then DPS or something like that. In almost all those cases, it's very rare to need one person alone to be healed for a large hit of healing. Tank busters is probably the best example of it, because those are usually just a very big hit that needs to be heavily mitigated and healed through, especially this tier where there are bleed effects on top of it. But generally speaking, healing multiple people. So again, a great example of this is in P5, where the boss will do 2 back-to-back tank busters, where one needs to go on one tank and one needs to go on the other, and both will be given a bleed. At that point, using the AoE heal is better because you are less likely to overheal, meaning your healing is more efficient, and it's sort of covering off the amount of damage coming into 2 people rather than topping up one and then needing more healing. Again, because if we think about that heal per second, one has got a very high heal per second, one has got a low heal per second, and the DPS per second is somewhere in the middle there. So we need to manage both of them. And so AoE healing, very good, and often doesn't need to be targeted. I don't know if I mentioned that in this. I do. Good job, me. Most AoE healing is either going to be self-targeted, as in it just comes from you, or there will be sort of ground effects you place in a specific spot. There are a handful of spells that are AoE, like particularly I think Cure 3 is a good example of that, where it is both targeted and an AoE. But as a general rule, if you can just throw out an AoE, you don't have to stop targeting the boss. You shoot the boss with whatever your preferred shoot method is, and then you just go, pew, heal around me. Spread your healing petals, and then go back to shooting without having to go shoot. Hey, get healed. Pew, 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 pew. Something like that, which is good. This is a really big one, and where I have a personal pain, and this is particularly in a raid situation, obviously, because of co-healers. Remember to play to the tempo of your co-healer. So if we remember before, what we talked about with tempos of healing is that certain jobs will want to heal in different ways. So something like a shield / barrier / passive healer, they generally want to offset damage or build up or heal over time. Something like White Mage is really good at healing someone who's hurt, but terrible at preventing damage. The thing to remember with this is people will meme a lot about White Mages being the quote glare bot. So glare is the default attack. Now it's glare 3 technically. Let's not ask about glare 2. That gets into weird deep lore. But they'll be sitting there spamming their attack button, and people are like, I can't believe that White Mage isn't healing. Like, we need them to heal us up, but they're just sitting here shooting stuff. And the thing that's not being recognized is that the other healer is too nervous or not respecting basically how a White Mage wants to heal. So how a White Mage wants to heal is a White Mage wants the party to get hurt, and then the White Mage wants to heal them. But if for example, a Scholar is too aggressive with shielding people through raid wides, if they put in a big shield when it's not needed, the white mage has nothing to do. Like, they can pop out one heal, maybe, but then they just don't have it. And similarly, with the way that lilies work now, where you want to actively be casting them, lilies are extremely powerful because they are used for both movement, and they're used for healing. And they are basically free in terms of healing because after you use a certain number of them, you get damage back. So the thing with white mage is a lot of the time, and how a good white mage will play, again, go back to the thing where my number is very big. The reason that works is it's because you know when damage is coming in. You know when you can hold those heals to say, I'm going to need to move in 8 seconds. We're not taking any damage for another 15 seconds. So I'm going to leave the party low until I need to move, and then couple my movement with healing on the rest of the party. So I can attack, and then heal. By the time we get attacked again, everyone's topped up. And that's a very good use of healing because you're not rushing out heals instead. But what happens, again, with people not playing to the tempo of the other healer, is then the other one will say, well, God, this white mage isn't healing. I'm going to rush heals up, and all of a sudden now they've dumped heals when they should be still attacking. Because they've then healed the party, the white mage has nothing left to do except for dumping heals that do nothing, and it's just kind of a waste. And everyone's just like grumpy at the white mage. The white mage didn't deserve it. Stop healing the damage that the white mage can heal. Again, this is difficult because it's in my case, it's a lot of pug environments. As opposed to an optimized situation where I would say, hey, Scholar, let's have a chat with that ominous tone of voice about what healing's happening. But in general, don't rush to heal where it's not needed in this case. Or similarly, that same vein, right, is if a white mage will have a lot of resources available to heal afterwards, you can 100% be shield less, because the white mage will be equipped to heal it back up, or in a situation where the resources are tighter, that's where you would want to shield more. So just understanding that is sort of pretty important. This is a big one as well for people who are looking to start improving. Again, let's go right back to the start over here. You can't see it, but it's somewhere over here is the start of this video, where I talked about one of the main things you can do to improve is to be responsible with your own improvement and looking for things to improve on. XIV analysis is a really great tool that lets you upload logs into it, and it'll sort of give you a breakdown of what how you played, where you can improve. The problem with it will highlight 2 particular things that can often be completely misrepresented in the case of healing. So one of them is overheal. Which falls very much into the same conversation of AoE breakpoints that we talked about before. If I need to heal the 2 tanks, and it makes sense to use an AoE heal to do that, great. I efficiently heal both of them, 400 potency to each. Happy days. If the rest of the party is around, including myself, obviously, because I'm there, and they don't need a heal, I've now just used 6 400 potency heals in overheal. So I technically have a 75% overheal on 2 very efficient heals. And that's bad. Like that assumption is like, oh, well, this person's healing way too much. They don't know what's going on. Or similar to what I mentioned before, because White Mage wants to use lilies for movement in order to keep misery available during burst, it will have certain times where it says, okay, well, I can just use a lily here to move, even though there's no healing that needs to happen. That's just all overheal. But it's optimal because it's keeping damage rolling the way it should be. I'm effectively using it as a free cast. So focusing on things like overheal is often a pretty bad measure. The same thing with the other half of this that it does is it looks at cooldowns in the same way that it looks at DPS cooldowns. Now, DPS cooldowns, if you boil down basically everything, it's attack does damage. It's either attack does damage over time, or attack makes something else or someone else do more damage. So therefore, you want to use them as much as possible to make as much damage happen as you can. Easy. That's not the case with healing. Like we used or the example before, there could be a case where in a 7-minute fight, I could use a 3-minute skill like Lilybell at 1 minute, 4 minute, or 1 minute, 4 minutes, and 7 minutes. If I want to use it at minute 2 and minute 5, it'll then say, well, you missed a use. And you don't miss a use there. You use it efficiently where you need it, because a lot of the healing tools aren't always needed in every situation. Last year was really bad for this because White Mage has a skill called Aqua Veil, which is basically just like an extra tank mitigation, where it reduces damage taken for 8 seconds by 15%, which is basically like, hey, tank, here's a free mitigation on your tank buster, and you can use that every minute. But last year also had a lot of the tanks getting hit by tank busters. Two main things, where either the tanks would just use their invulnerability skills, so it didn't matter if they were mitigated or not. You didn't need to overmit that, or you wouldn't get benefit from mitigating it more, so you didn't need to do that. Or similarly, there was hits going out that were hitting everyone, and so because of the environment, at least where I was playing it, there wasn't a need to protect anyone more. There wasn't really a need to use that skill, like we're saying, like actively or proactively. Now, technically, we come back to that thing and say, okay, well, does it help? And if I do use it and I'm not going to have a use for it otherwise, should I use it? Yeah, sure. But at the same time, if it's not actually giving a meaningful benefit where it's saving me anything by using it, it's not actually worth using. So, the only thing you should be worried about with XIV analysis, and also FF logs in general, your base starting point should be how much uptime did they have? How much time were they spent casting spells? And importantly, how many heals did they do on the global cooldown rather than via OGCDs? Because at that point, that becomes a question of, is there anything that the healers could have done to reduce the amount of heals that were GCD casted versus standard attacking during that time? Or, if not, was that heal needed, or was it sort of just like superfluous? Some healers are going to need to GCD heal because that's how it works. Not all of the healers have, the healers have different potencies on their attacks and deal damage in different ways. So you need to plan around that a bit. But just sort of like using a number that says, well, you didn't use this one niche ability enough where there was no good place to use it. Or similarly, you healed so much because that's the way the profile of damage on that fight worked. And they're very easy metrics to try and point out and say, why are you doing this wrong? Without actually understanding, are they doing the requirement, which is as much damage as possible? That's, I think, basically it. Otherwise, we're kind of at the end of where I wanted to talk about. If you've got any questions, please ask away. Otherwise, that's kind of, all I had really on the docket. I'm going to take another sip of water because, boy, howdy, does me talking and ranting for an hour and a half kind of kill me. Otherwise, I really do hope people have enjoyed or learnt something from this. Again, I'll try and figure out how to just drag it on out of Twitch to get it. So in terms of who to steal from, who would I usually go to? Honestly, a lot of the times, just going onto YouTube and looking for anyone who's uploaded a log is a good starting point. While then sort of while playing it, I think some of the really big players, so I go to Momo a lot, Momo Summer, who they do a lot of very optimized runs. They're the ones who have got crazy speed runs and stuff like that. But it's also a good point to understand why so again, if you're familiar with, say, this is the same thing as Warcraft logs, where people will be tiered based on how much damage they're doing and so forth. their logs they'll have hundreds. They'll have like literally the pinnacle of damage. And that's a really good sort of place to start and say, okay, well, how, like, even just looking at a log and saying how many casts of certain skills. So, for example, if you're playing something like Scholar, which does have some of those GCD heals you may want to use, so like Adlo for a deployment or something like that, go and check and say, okay, what are they using that on, or are they using it at all? Particularly if you see them, people who run it a lot will have a lot of logs. And it's good to sort of compare between, say, early runs as well and later runs, because later ones will obviously have more gear, they'll be more optimized and more practiced. So taking some of those runs and looking early on and saying where are they using things when, it's a really good point to start. Otherwise, if you're already doing content like extremes or anything like that, checking logs for other people in your group as a basis of that, right? What you will want to do if you go more specific. So, for example, if I'm looking at something for White Mage and trying to compare myself, there are certain things you should have know to look for. Like, for example, what I mentioned before. Now with 6.1 onwards, the Lily spells are basically DPS neutral. And if you use them on relative cooldown, the damage that you carry across with Misery will be under burst, so you'll want to do that. So what you want to look for there is, are people using those on cooldown? If they're not using them on cooldown, where are they using them instead? They're probably the main things as well, even on that sort of like smaller scale, when you're going and reviewing your own logs, is looking at what are healers who are doing, like healing your runs using for what as a sort of comparison. If you're doing the current trials are honestly kind of a train wreck to start healing on. That thing's a beast. It's kind of terrifying, to be honest. But because mainly, to be clear, that fight has a cadence and tempo that is very unlike other fights. There's a lot of healing coming out very quickly, or needed very quickly, I should say, because there's so much damage that it's a tough point to start. And that's actually a really, really good point that I did forget to mention in my recommendations. The biggest mistake you can do if you want to learn to heal is learning in a learning environment. Now, that is intentionally some jank ass English that I'm using, so let me clarify that because it sounds clickbaity. When I say you don't want to learn in a learning environment, specifically what I mean by that is that, and this is coming from me who nearly didn't get into healing because of how this worked. I'd cleared probably at least maybe the first 2 or 3 tiers of, I'd have to double check exactly when on timing, at least the first, I think, 3 tiers of Savage that came out. So P1, 2, 3, before I started trying to heal semi-seriously. Actually, I think I did P4. The first time I went in, I was on Sage, and I was like, okay, I'm new to healing in Savage. I'm not sure how much healing is going to be needed. So I went into a learning party. The problem with learning in a learning party is it's extremely difficult to know if you're healing well or not, because everyone who's in a learning party is probably not going to be doing mechanics well, which means they're going to be taking extra damage than they need, and you're going to be spending a lot of time raising people or over-healing things because people have dropped down to health or low health, so you need to heal them back up. And that is a big complicating factor, because like, you then can't build a heal plan that says, when this mechanic happens, I need to use these 2 skills, and that'll be enough. So, for example, if we look at something like the first mechanic in P1S, which is, again, what I started using, you had the chain mechanics with Ericthonius, right? In theory, you probably only need, like, okay, I'll throw a Caracol shield up and maybe a Physis 2 if I'm feeling spicy, just to get some mitigation going and some healing over time. So they'll take the damage and we'll heal back up before the next major mechanic happens, right? That's the theory of what happens. But then people stand in the wrong spot and 4 people die. And then it's really, really difficult to figure out if you're healing well Like, okay, did they die because I didn't give them enough healing, or I didn't give them enough shields, or are they undergeared and that's what's happened? Um, and so if you go into a learning environment with people who are also learning the fight for the first time, it's very difficult to figure out how you should be handling it. So, what my recommendation would be, the two ways you learn to heal in particular, if you want to get a good basis, is either in a group of friends who are also just kind of there to hang out and mess around and who are familiar with the fight, or once you've cleared a fight on a job you're comfortable with, make or join a alt job party. Like, they're in Party Finder pretty regularly, particularly for the current Savage, where it's like, okay, cool, here's a party specifically for people who know how the fight should be done, but want to try it on things they are less comfortable with. So then you should be seeing people making mistakes around, okay, the tank didn't mitigate enough, or people may not do things necessarily like 100%, but the overall idea of how they should be doing it should be right. So at that point, if you're not healing enough, it's probably because you're not healing enough. Or you can start making some good assessments from there, reviewing that information and going, okay, this person died. Why did they die? Did they take too much damage and we need to top them up? Did they take excess damage and they kind of screwed up and they need to fix that? That's something they need to do. Or what is it? Like, what can we do? Like, a big thing for healing, I think, is eventually learning how to recover bad situations, like knowing how to heal and when. But until that point, really the main thing you should try and focus on is removing as many variables of people who don't know what's going on as possible. So, like, don't go and join a farm party for a fight that you haven't done the role for. Like, okay, I'm going to go and join the EX4 on a healer and just figure it out because I have beaten it on a DPS and we'll wing it. We'll be fine. Find a group where it makes sense, but don't go in trying to teach people mechanics while you're trying to learn other role responsibilities. Find a group where that makes more sense because people know what to do. Aside from that, again, the big thing for me is just watching on YouTube, especially if you want to go in for the first time, and this applies to anything. Do that, or again, if you know someone else. So, for example, Wesk, who is in the Discord, whose Discord we are all in functionally, for now. I would look at his logs and check what the healers in his party are doing. How are they handling mechanics? From there find, are there gaps that we've got? Are there things we could do better? Or things we could do in a different way? And that's probably like the main starting point for it. And then from there, find people, again, if there are people, like in my case, Momo's a really good example because I know, hey, here's the pinnacle. What does the pinnacle look like? And how far am I from that? And the closer I can get, the better. Is probably the answer to that question, along with some other questions I remembered I'd meant to answer along the way. I'm trying to think as well if there's anything else. I feel like there's maybe one or two things that I could have mentioned but have yet to. But otherwise, we'll probably close then to wrapping it up. I'm not emotionally sure if I can keep doing any more after this because this has been a lot of fun. And I've really enjoyed doing this and talking through it. And if I just hadn't put this slideshow together, mostly in the last 4 hours before I promised that I would actually do the presentation, that would have helped me conceptually. But otherwise, thanks very much for hanging out. We've had people watching the whole time, which is great, especially once I figured out how to fix my stream from freaking out, but that's probably more a case of there's some other stuff on the other side I need to solve. Aside from that, thanks everyone for watching. If you do have any other questions, find me in the Discord, ask me, because like I mentioned before, take responsibility, because I have given you information for how to approach healing, but at the end of the day, I am not going to be the person pressing the buttons for you. You are still going to have to heal. You are still going to have to, again, if you want a DPS, if you want to apply some of this logic to tanking, do that as well. And again, what a really good idea, or how I would, what I would recommend doing is like a little experiment, and partially why I left out some of this information as well, is take that logic, the two main things I think I mentioned, which is thinking of skills as reactive, as active, or as proactive. Look at the skill set for the different healers and try and like map that out in your head. Where do you want to use that? Or similarly, if you're thinking about it in a dungeon space, say, okay, if I'm at level, even level 70 or level 80 or 90 again, if you want to go all the way up, break that down. What is a 2-minute skill look like? What does a 1-minute skill look like? What do those lists look like? And how do you use it? I think actually probably the last thing I was going to mention on that same vein, which kind of feels into the inefficient thing. Actually, no, I discussed that. That's fine. We don't need to worry about that. I've already given good examples. But yeah, look through that stuff, mess around, ask questions, see if there's anything you want to know and tell me, and I will try and answer it for you. But otherwise, thank you so much for indulging it. I literally am at 56 followers. It was way easier to get those last 6 that I got than the like 6 or 7 or 8 that I needed to get here in the first place. Turns out streaming's not so hard. Something like that. And honestly, like, this is going to come up in the sign-off, which I'll do right about now, where I find my end of stream button over here as we slide on over. It is some of the things I've said today were intentionally pretty spicy. Either like some broad strokes on people copping out in terms of how they try and learn, or just being more focused on things like just leveling up because there are level ups to get. I still think that's relevant. But at the same time, just because up until now you haven't gotten the experience you've needed, or haven't done all the steps, or like, completed everything you wanted to do, or you've got that healer and it's now going to be a case that it takes a bit to learn how to heal. Yeah, cool. That's it. Now take those steps. Now you get to learn. And if you've skipped all the leveling part and you didn't have to pay for a boost, probably, unless you're me, in which case I paid for at least 2 boosts, maybe more, depending on how I feel about it. But that was only because I knew how to play the job already. I was boosting up to do that stuff. That's an exception, not the rule. Don't just boost. Please don't boost. Well, actually, no, do boost if you need to, because value your time over money. That's the one, a very rare exception, sort of, that I'm okay with spending money on in the market, on the store, which is either things that are reasonably priced or things where spending money is equivalent to offsetting time. So instead, essentially, you're paying to get that time back, which could probably come back to a better question about how is the end game rating set up to where we can't, well, the only solution is to pay the company more money so that we can raid in a fun way with friends without penalizing at least one person, if not more. These are big questions, but not for this stream. Maybe for another stream. Yeah, if I decide to do this, I may not do it. Like, I'll probably stream a bit through the week, as a general idea about what comes next. And again, probably on the weekend again, a bit longer. And then if I come up with a good idea, I might do this sort of game design thing again. Oh, thank you for the bit. Oh, adorable. I may do something like this again next week. I've got some ideas about things like button bloat that people love to complain about but don't necessarily understand. And I do feel like if I did the removing Kaiten was the right move, in the wrong direction. That seems like a clickbaity enough. Well, actually, no, it's not clickbaity. That's just a hella good title name for a stream. Yeah, and I do still have someone who I need to now make sure actually downloads the Final Fantasy XIV client, because that game has a free trial up to level 60, including the award-winning expansion Heavenswood, with no playtime or restrictions, except for some stuff around spending money. But yeah, so until next time, thank you for hanging out. Thank you for spending time, and I hope you've learned something useful. And as always, be kind to yourself, be kind to other people, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.